Welcome, everybody, to our session, Centering Indigenous Pedagogies with a Focus on Assessment. My name is Cynthia Nicol, and I'm a professor in the Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy at UBC. And I'm a member of the Indigenous Math Education Network, and we're facilitating today's session on the traditional unceded lands of the Musqueam people. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be on these lands and working and living and playing on these lands. And I'd like to invite you to introduce yourself and the lands that you're currently on or wherever you may be. Please feel free to write that in the chat. And our session today is sponsored by a number of different groups: the Indigenous Math Education Network, the David Robitaille STEM Network, Dogwood 25, BC Ministry of Education, and the Rural Education Advisory, as well as the Edith Lando Virtual Learning Center. I'm pleased to introduce my colleagues who are co-hosting and facilitating the session. We have Joanne Archibald Kwam from UBC and Dogwood 25, Janice Novakowski, who you've met, and she invited you in to the session from the UBC and School District 38, Stephanie LaFrance from UBC is a doctoral student at UBC. Leighton Schnellert is a little bit late, but he should be showing up. He's at UBC as well, around 4 o'clock or so. Josh Essery has just informed us that he's very sick and he's unable to make it today. So hopefully we'll be able to include his work in a next session that we have in April. But we do have Nichola Williams, who is a high school teacher from Nanaimo on Vancouver Island in BC. So thank you, everybody, for joining us and being here today. So I also wanted to just introduce Cuggan Jad, who you see there on the left side of the screen. And Cuggan Jad is a supernatural shape shifter. And Billy Yovanovich, a Haida artist, drew this for us. And he says that Cuggan Jad is a little bit like math. It's always kind of waiting on the edges and the corners, on the outskirts of things, just ready to give you a hand to help you solve a problem. Always there, always trying to help out. So welcome to Cuggan Jad as well. Our guiding question for this series is continuing from the series we had last year, which focused on centering Indigenous pedagogies and perspectives in math education. In that series, we focused a little bit on culturally responsive math assessment, and we also have another webinar series just on culturally responsive math assessment. But we just know that our thinking about assessment is just really complex. It can be very challenging, and we just know that it's something that we want to refer to a little bit further. Last month, we did a session on thinking about centering Indigenous pedagogies in math education with a focus on assessment. And we used the 3 different perspectives of assessment as ecosystems, assessment as pedagogy, and assessment as Indigenous storywork to help us kind of think a little bit more about these overlapping and interrelated perspectives to give us a sense of different ways in which we can think about assessment, different ways in which we might have different kinds of relationships with our students in our classrooms, because we know that assessment can really change our position as a kind of a gatekeeper or a position of authority. It can change our relationship with our students and their families. It can also provide valuable feedback to us as teachers in our own practice, and feedback and information to students. But it can also do a lot of harm, and it can also at the same time be very supportive. So we know that assessment can have this kind of long-lasting effect, and it can be either positive or negative, and affect students' confidence and their abilities and their identities for a long time after it can occur. So it's a very important area, and it's something I think that we're all trying to think about more carefully as we think about ways in which Indigenous pedagogies and practices can inform our assessment. So that's just a bit of a highlight of what we did last. I'm going to go into a little bit more of that, what we did actually last session. But Joanne is going to speak a little bit about Indigenous assessment as Indigenous storywork, and just to give us some highlights of what we spoke about in our last session. Joanne?
Yes. Thank you, Cynthia. Swayal, everyone. I'm joining you from the Vancouver area on the traditional unceded lands of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I come from Stalo Nation and have ancestry also in the Hakalip community, Statlium Nation. And we focused on three particular principles of Indigenous story work. And there are a total of 7 principles that I learned from elders, cultural knowledge holders, and storytellers, many from Stalo Nation and others from Coast Salish nations. And that you see the 7 principles on the slide here. And to know more about them, you could take a look at the Indigenous Storywork website, where I discuss the particular principles in short videos. But we took a look at 3 principles that could guide us in thinking about assessment. And those principles included holism, interrelatedness, and synergy. So if we can go to the next slide here, which gives a bit of a background about, the questions we might ask when you think why I focused on those 3 principles, holism, interrelatedness, and synergy, is that they also can connect um, quite quite strongly to pedagogy, of course, to ecosystem. And when you think about holism, it could address heart, mind, body, and spirit. And when we think of body, it could include our actions, our planning, our problem solving, and to think about ways that we might engage in assessing math learning, and perhaps we could use story, and story can open up space for us to think about feelings, to think about wonder and awe as students learn math, and to think to ask ourselves, how might our assessment practices reflect holistic understandings of Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing? How might they reflect emotions in a way? And we might also think about holism in the way of the connections to oneself, to family, to community, to environment, to nature. And to think of our assessment practice uh, and how the practice might bring in aspects of culture and community. So it really shows that interrelatedness with holism, that we think of connections. How might we ensure that, in a sense, when students are learning math, that we also, this gets into pedagogy, but can relate to assessment. But think of our pedagogy. How might it be somewhat holistic in nature, address learning, but address problem solving or creativity? And to think about how would we assess that? And to think about the connections. Perhaps students will share some of their knowledge, their ways of knowing that come from their home or their community. And our challenge as educators is to somehow connect ways that we teach math and Indigenous ways of knowing, and then have a thread there also in assessment. I think somehow it can open up our assessment practice. And to think about the idea of synergy, that, when students are learning, we think about how might they show aspects of their learning? Might they work together as a small group on a project? Might they share their understandings of a story and think of how math is embedded in that story? And then to also think about the ways that they share their learning with each other. And is there a particular synergy that happens when they share? One person might give an idea that can spark a connection with another student. And of course, we could think of multimodal ways of knowing, of experiencing, of doing, of using aspects of technology. So that way, the learning process becomes vibrant. And then we have to think, how can our assessment practice be as vibrant as our pedagogy? So those were a little bit of what we had talked about in relation to those three Indigenous storywork principles and how they might guide assessment with math.
Right. Thank you, Joanne. And then at the elementary level, when thinking about assessment as pedagogy, we had examples at the elementary level and also at the secondary level. And at the elementary level, Janice Novakowski shared a project, a collaborative project that she worked with Richmond School District teachers, where students listened to local Indigenous stories of the land to emphasize how stories are embedded in the land, and then studied different kinds of maps, a Google geography map, a road map, a Indigenous language map of Hunkaminam languages. And then students built with 3D materials, creating mountains and rivers, their local places. And then from there, they created actual mathematical stories connected to their place. And at the and then with that had these various questions of thinking about assessment in terms of it being responsive and reciprocal and reflective, and thinking about what do we notice as teachers, and then how do we create openings for children to be able to reflect and have their own self-assessment so that they can be the ones, not always the teachers saying that this is good or not, or this is right or wrong, or having students be able to be in that position to notice what it is that they're learning and what they need to learn more of. And then at the secondary level, we shared some examples. Here, the slide just shows the Blanketing the City project, which is a project with Musqueam Weaver, Deborah Sparrow, that began a few years ago, and it's a public art project. And then, so it's just thinking about how students could create their own public art math walks, and what would that walk look like, and how could they design it? Or thinking about how to do land water restoration, as this example here shows about restoring the Tatlow Creek from it being submerged through culverts to daylighting it so that it can actually flow to the ocean or to the river. And examples such as these at the secondary level, where students could work on questions that get them thinking about noticing and wondering as educators, what can we notice and wonder for our students thinking in this particular kind of project? And how does a restoration project differ from a ground up design project? These are all questions that are specific to the project, but are ones that we might prompt thinking about assessment as part of our pedagogy. It's not something that's we do the project and then we assess, but it's something that is along the way. It's a very much an integrated, holistic aspect of thinking about assessment and teaching. And then we had thinking about assessment as an ecosystem. And I don't know, I got really inspired by a project on Haida Gwaii called the Fu Sea Otter Project. And we had planned for Nadine Wilson of Haida Gwaii to share a little bit more about this project with you. But she was unable to attend because of a death in the community, an elder's death in the community. So hopefully she can attend maybe another session that we have where we're kind of talking about this. But I guess very inspired by the whole project. She worked on, Nadine Wilson worked on it in terms of with the Council of the Haida Nation and Parks Canada and reserves. So it's a really interesting project, and I think Janice is going to put a link in the chat related to that. So this is a map of Haida Gwaii, just to give you a sense of where this project takes place. So it's in the Pacific Northwest above Vancouver Island. And the ku, which is Haida for sea otter, the ku and the Haida live together for millennia. And the ku provided resources for Haida people. And they ate some of the same foods together, like the sea urchins and clams and crabs. And they lived together in a way that was very symbiotic, where they gave room for each to have enough food to eat. And had like a very healthy, balanced ecosystem. But in the 1800s or so, that relationship really changed because of the fur trade. And the ku population just went down drastically, and they almost became ecologically extinct in the waters off of Haida Gwaii. So without the ku, or the sea otter, the waters and the underwater forests of Haida Gwaii really changed. And without any sea otters around to eat these red sea urchins here, the sea urchins really love to eat kelp. So what did the sea urchins do? They ate all the kelp. So then there were no longer any kelp forests. So you can't see any kelp forests in this image here. And the kelp forests provided nourishment and protection for various other wildlife like herring, clams, and salmon. So losing the kelp forest affected the populations of the herring and the clams and the salmon. But what's really inspiring and hopeful is that recently there have been some new sightings of the ku on the waters around Haida Gwaii, and it's the first in 150 years. So there's been a few sightings of the ku and their pups. So it's really, the community is now trying to think about what will happen here. How will this change the ecosystem of the kelp forests and the sea urchins and clams and salmon, and how will that change how the humans and non-humans are kind of building that relationship together? So how will it even change the human harvesting of the sea urchin, for example? With less sea urchins, there might be less harvesting of them. But it just is a nice story to kind of think about that balance that we live in between how everything is really connected. And then thinking about uh, assessment as an ecosystem, thinking about assessment as a part of all of our practices as teachers. So we have some questions that we asked people to think about last session that we had, and we put those in a Google Doc. We had them in a Google Doc where you could contribute to those, and we just have them here just for you to kind of briefly take a look at. We're going to revisit these later in the session, and we'll have some discussion about them. But these questions, maybe we can even put them in the chat. Maybe Janice, I don't know if that would even work, or we can just send people to the Google Doc. But these are really good questions. And I think that it would be great if we can spend a bit of time as the co-host, maybe sort of talking about a few of these questions, and then also letting you think about it, and maybe in our third session coming back and then talking a little bit more about them. So what I'm going to, that was a bit of a preview or a synopsis of what we talked about in our first session on this series of centering Indigenous pedagogies and practices in math education with a focus on assessment. And today I wanted to talk a little bit more about this idea and metaphor of thinking about assessment as ecosystem. So the example I gave of the ku and the sea otter and the relationship to the kelp forest in the waters of Haida Gwaii with the human and the non-human is one example. Here is another example, and you may have seen this video. I'm not going to play it for you here, but it's a short video about 5 minutes long, and it's called How Wolves Changed the River. And you think, how could that be? How can wolves change a river? But it's a really cool story, and it's about how wolves in the Yellowstone National Park changed the river, where I think the last wolf was killed in about 1926. And so wolves were hunted as the country became more settled and colonized. The last pack of wolves were killed, as I mentioned, in about 1926. And then they were reintroduced again into the park in the mid 1990s. But this particular video shares the story of that reintroduction of the wolves and how it had this really interconnected kind of cascading effect with the wolves being introduced. Then the wolves are able to hunt more deer, and with less deer, that led to more meadows being more forested. So the deer had eaten a lot of the undergrowth, so it created more meadows. And so then with the wolves hunting the deers, and that allowed for less meadow and more trees to grow and the forest to build up again. And that stabilized the banks of the river, so there was less erosion. And that led to the change in the movement and the flow of the river. So a beautiful example of this kind of nicely cascading effect of an ecosystem. Here's another example, which is another example of how not human beings, but animal beings can change the landscape and place. This is the largest beaver dam in the world, is where I have this little red dot here. And this beaver dam is in Alberta, northern Alberta. It's so big that you can see it from a satellite. And this is a picture of it here. So the front end of the beaver dam is about 7 football fields long. And I just found these statistics. It holds about 92,000 dump trucks of water or 1,600 hockey rinks of water. I figured that one out. It's quite an amazing piece because people didn't know it was even there because of it's so hard to get into this area. They only discovered it because of the satellite photos showing that this was the largest beaver dam. So just again showing how beaver dams can change the place in which they're living. Here's an example of grizzly bears in ecosystems. So Greg Kahati, who's a scholar and ethnobiologist, writes about how Indigenous peoples were actually led to various medicines in the forest by bears, and that many Indigenous people in North America and bears have coexisted together for like thousands of years. And then in the Navajo language, many medicinal plants actually have the name Navajo, a Navajo word in it, which means for bear, right in the name of it. So for example, there's a plant that the Navajo use to treat stomach aches and bacterial infections. And it's also a plant that the bears travel long distances to find so that they can also treat their own stomach aches and bacterial infections. So humans watching the bears eat these particular plants are able to learn which plants to eat and which plants not to. So the plant was healing both humans and bears, and that the bears were teaching humans what's safe to eat and what should be avoided. Here is another example of a really cool study where a team of researchers from UVic and other institutions, they came together with 5 First Nations groups in BC in the Central Coast. And their research took 11 years, and they collected bear hair samples. And they found by collecting these various bear hair samples that there are 3 genetically distinct grizzly bear groups, and that these 3 distinct groups live in different areas of the BC coast, and that those 3 distinct groups align with 3 distinct language groups, so the Tsimshian, the Wakashan, and the Salishan Nuxalk. And that's you can see that in the gray lines that are showing where the red, the green, and the blue are. So the research team concluded that the grizzlies, like as with people, had everything they needed to be right where they are, so that they could have these distinct groups. So they had rich sand resources, they had water access, they had materials for their shelter, and there was no need to move beyond the rich, diverse areas that they were in. So we had distinct grizzly bear populations as well as distinct language group populations there. So it's like no surprise then to the community and the elders with this research that the community members weren't surprised about this, and that the authors even dedicated the paper to an elder who had taught them that people learned their language and the way of life from the bears. So bears were considered as family, and they were really kept family in the sense that they were kept at a respectful distance as maybe we'd like some of our own family members to be. But they when they were trying to figure out how much fish to catch, when people were trying to figure out how much fish to catch, the decisions were made thinking about the bears and how much the bears had, because if the bears were well fed, then they could be kept at a respectful distance. But if the bears are hungry, then they're going to be, and there would be more human bear encounters. So they were practicing the principle of enoughness, taking enough so they could satisfy people, but also taking enough that the not so much that the bears didn't also have something, so that they could live in an ecosystem in harmony. So and then just sort of thinking about the wolves video as well, like if there's enough salmon for the marine animals and bears, that means that there's enough of the animals, the bears, to be able to catch the fish and then eat them and then go into the forest, and then they can kind of the decay and fertilizer will then support the waterways and so provide shade and more hospitable water temperatures. So it's all interconnected. It's a systems approach, a real ecosystem way of thinking about it. So, um, so thinking about assessment as an ecosystem, then we can sort of think about these various questions of thinking about, what is it that students then come into our classrooms with? What are they bringing with them? What are the funds of knowledge that they come with that we need to be paying attention to? Because they aren't just a separate being. They actually have this other ecosystem that they're connected with, their family, their community, their nation. So how can we be more open to value and make sense of what students are bringing to the classroom is something that we can think about with this metaphor of thinking about assessment as an ecosystem. And then thinking about assessment as interrelatedness of being really embedded in our teaching and what it is that we notice. How do we prepare for our teaching? So thinking about assessment as embedded in teaching and learning, and that assessment itself has teaching and learning in it. So asking ourselves, how do we ready ourselves to respond to evidence in evidence of learning in the moment? So if we can be thinking about opening ourselves to thinking about assessment in lots of different places and as part of our teaching and learning, then we can think about being ready to respond to these moments that can be evidence of learning. Yeah, and I think that would be a good one to think about later and ask them, have a discussion around, I think, as well, that question. And then just before I introduce Nichola to talk a little bit about her project, I just wanted to throw these questions out again. These were also shared in our first session around assessment practices, but thinking about assessment as nourishing our relationships with each other and with our students, thinking about the value of collaboration as well as individual success. So how do we actually do that? How might we do that? How can assessment contribute to the family and the community and both the thriving and to be and well-being? And then how can assessment create life-friendly conditions that benefit all, not just humans, but also the more than human? And I think the ecosystems examples are kind of helping us think more about that. And then how can assessment be integral to all aspects of our teaching? So thinking about it not only in assessment as evaluation, but maybe assessment as informing our learning about who our students are and what they're coming with. So just a sense now of thinking a little bit more of ecosystems with human and more than human and place and that relationship and how things are connected and everything is connected to everything else. So with that, I'm going to invite Nichola to share a little bit about her work as a teacher in Nanaimo. And Nichola works in the Qualicum School District in School District 69 in Parksville on the Coast Salish territory, and specifically the territory of the Nanaimo First Nations, and works on the shared territory of the Sanahwahas and the Qualicum First Nations. She's a grade 10, 11, and 12 teacher, specializing in math and biology. And when she's not working, you can find her walking her dog on the local trails and beaches, volunteering as a leader with her daughters, aged 9 and 13, and their scout groups, and helping coach at the softball field. So, Nichola, thank you for joining us, and looking forward to hearing more about your project. You'll
Yes,
just have to
thank
tell me
you.
when you want the slides to go.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I had the opportunity to do an assignment that is focused around working with Indigenous Storywork and bringing that into towards a math task. So kind of combining Indigenous Storywork and moving towards math. And so I decided to work with a story around the Champagne raccoon population at a park that's quite local to our area. So right off of the Nanaimo coast, we have a park there, which is now called Saskatchewan. Yep, there it is, Newcastle, formerly known as Newcastle, and it's now named Saskatchewan. Since the Snuneymuxw First Nation is now running that park. They have a contract with Parks Canada to run the park. And so it has been renamed. And there's a very unique raccoon population that lives on Saskatchewan. There is the sort of traditional coloration of raccoons, which is the black and gray coloration that we probably mostly think of when we think raccoons. But there is also a champagne coloration that appears every once in a while on this island as well. So in sort of setting up this math task, I really spent some time kind of like looking into this park and working on really just bringing the idea of how we got to the name change, and started by kind of asking students if they had been to this local park area and had visited the island themselves. So I think we're okay there. Cynthia, to switch up slides. Excellent. And so part of the conversation in sort of setting up the story and setting up the task, in asking students if they had been to the park, was talking a little bit about the name change and asking if any of them knew where Saskatchewan was. And many of them didn't quite have an idea yet. Lots of them still wanted to sort of refer to it by the Newcastle name. So it gave a nice little opening for us to have some conversation about why that name change took place, and kind of going into the correct naming of Saskatchewan as the park. And then one more. And so on the Parks Canada site, you can see that they have updated with the new name, and they still have the older Newcastle name there bracketed off. But one of the things we noticed that when we looked at the Google Maps, which was on kind of the very first slide there, is that the Google Maps had not yet updated the name to Saskatchewan, and it still had it only referred to as Newcastle. So there was a little bit of interesting conversation around that piece, and kind of just setting up the story around the importance of this park to the Snuneymuxw First Nations. And we were also able to find some stories that were told by a local knowledge keeper and elder, perfect, David Borali. So he acts as a knowledge keeper for the Snuneymuxw First Nations, and he also gives cultural tours at Saskatchewan in the park, and he has some of his stories recorded, so we could access an oral story that he tells, one of them being specifically about the champagne version, so champagne coloration, sorry, of the raccoons. So this was pretty exciting because we were able to sort of bring this oral story right into the classroom. We were able to watch and listen to the story being told in David's own words, and kind of hear how the champagne coloration of raccoons came to be on the island of Saskatchewan. So the sort of summary of the story is that the champagne raccoons were given the champagne coloration by a transformer who witnessed them trying to steal the eagle's wings. They were holding onto the eagle so that they were trying to figured if they held onto the eagle tightly, they might learn how to fly. And the transformer saw this and said, oh, this is not okay. This is not how we learn from others. And in punishment, we are going to have now a white coloration or a champagne coloration on the raccoon, so that you won't be able to sneak up on anybody anymore. So it's to do with a visibility. And as part of this story, he states that the coloration will happen in 1 out of every 10 baby raccoons that they have. So the punishment will continue through generations. And so this was kind of where we kind of stopped and we did a little bit of notice and wonder around the story, kind of encouraging students to pull in any aspect of things that they noticed from the story, of things that they wondered about the story, and had some great cultural links in there, as well as some students that were picking up on, what is happening with that 1 to 10 ratio? How does that work? How do we get there? What's happening with that? So from there, perfect. We use that as a springboard to hop into some of the mathematical ideas that were around this champagne coat coloration. So I had students break out into small groups, and each of the groups got one of the genetics handouts there that you can see on the screen, and it just sort of gives a recap of what the genetic condition is. So it's having to receive 2 recessive traits for coat coloration that don't have the same amount of pigment as the black and gray coloration. And so I sort of drew in a little visual there for kiddos, just reminding like how it works. We get parent genetic combination from each parent, and that gets passed on through fertilization of sperm and egg. And what traits we get in that process are decided at random, so that the combination we get for the offspring, for the baby raccoon, comes 1 at random from mom and 1 at random from dad. And so we linked that a little bit to the genetic combination chart down the bottom there, and we can kind of see that we have 2 combinations that will lead to the black and gray coloration, and then 1 combination where if we get the 2 recessive forms of the trait, that we will have that champagne version of the raccoon. So I kind of let students explore this little handout. I walked them through the little kind of the graphics on there, and then I let them sort of explore the question on the bottom, which is, what's the chance if we have a mother raccoon that has 2 dominant forms of that genetic trait, what's the chance that that mom would end up with a champagne coloration offspring? And then same idea, what about if the mom had 1 of each of those traits, 1 dominant and 1 recessive, how would that look? And what about if they had 2 of the recessive forms of the trait, how would that look over time? So at that point, the students grouped up and they kind of, had to think about what kind of combinations could happen. It was really interesting to watch a group do this. There was lots of conversation about how to organize it. How do we make, how do we organize our thinking into the terms of different combinations that can happen? So we had some diagrams and we had some trees, and we had lots of different kind of visuals going on with their work, which was amazing to see. And in most of the groups were able to get, part of the way along. Some of them needed a little bit of reminding that there, of course, is not only going to depend on what traits are coming from mom, but it's also going to depend on the male that mom's mating with. So it's going to depend what genetic combination dad's going to bring to the table. So once they sort of are like, oh, right, we have to think about different dads, then they were kind of off to the races on that. And so that was really great. We kind of got to towards the end, once groups had enough time to do some thinking and kind of think through, we had a chance to share. They were doing them on erasable whiteboard sheets. So we had a chance for them to share out their sort of how they organized their thinking and what they found, and have a chance to kind of share and talk about them at the end. And then after that, I sort of also had shown them, hey, there is sort of an organizational tool that geneticists use called a Punnett square that does this organizing, that sort of was a different visual way that they could organize thinking. And then we also linked back to the story. I wanted to go sort of back to the story to kind of really think about all of those things that we sort of tried to set the stage up for. How can we now as learners, how can we take what we have learned from this story and kind of come full circle back? How can we share that learning forward with others? How can we show respect for the information that we learned today? And kind of also having a chance to link in the idea of the traditional ecological knowledge that was shared in the story about the frequency of the genetic patterns that were being observed. So we had some ideas like, well, we can start using the correct name for the park and referring to it as Sesatchin. We can, use that when we're talking about it with families. And so, yeah, kind of having a chance to sort of come full circle with that Indigenous Storywork piece as well. And then we sort of had a wee bit of time to touch on the idea like, well, is there other genetics, kind of patterns that, or traits that kind of follow the same frequencies, same patterns, same mathematical kind of combinations that we see with the raccoon colorations. And so we didn't have a ton of time to go into it, but we did sort of have a chance to mention with the group that I tried it out with that there is a very similar scenario on our BC coast that follows this exact same genetic condition with the spirit bears or the Kermode bears, and have a chance linked to that. But we were also finding out that the spirit bears have an even higher frequency usually than the 10%. So thinking that there may be an advantage in terms of that coloration for their population. So opportunity to explore further. I didn't quite get that far with the group I tried it out with, but yeah, so that was sort of what we did for the math task and working with Indigenous Storywork that I tried out with my group. We had lots of engagement, and I definitely noticed as I was going around and groups were doing that sort of ball toss and catch piece to assessment, making sure that they're sort of moving in the right direction, don't want to kind of prompt too much, but you want to make sure they have enough to be able to continue on through the aspects. And yeah, so that's sort of where we're at.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nichola. It's just so good to hear you share the story. And I'm glad that Janice put in the chat the video link for David Bodley to share the story. I hadn't put the, I thought I had that connected so that we could hear him share the story, but I didn't have it linked to it, so I'm sorry that we missed that, but you gave us a good summary of it, and the link is also in the chat. Now we have some opportunity for some questions, but maybe I can stop sharing and we can just have a little bit of a chat, or maybe there's some connections that you could make, Nichola, to thinking about how you might assess your project that you tried with your students. Or based on what you're hearing today, if there's other ways that you would think about how you might assess the students in this particular project, or how Storywork principles might guide you in thinking about assessment.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I really liked how Joanne had kind of phrased earlier on that, if our assessment practices could be as vibrant as our pedagogy, I was, really thinking about that as we went through. The students were vibrant doing this task and this activity, and kind of being able to think about how do we continue that on into the assessment so that it can be holistic. And I think, assessment as we're learning throughout the task, kind of doing that back and forth ball toss to kind of keep things moving forward, and kind of prompting as needed to move through is good. But I think, finding a way to bring in that more sort of holistic approach of going from like self and family and community. How do we show maybe I think there is opportunity for, students to bring in some of those connections that they had previously to the park. How do we continue that through assessing the task? I don't know if I have that completely figured out yet.
Yeah. How did you make some assessment decisions when you were offering the task to the students? What was it that you actually did notice when the students were doing that?
Well, when we were sort of starting out and looking at the story, and we did a little kind of, what are we noticing? What are we wondering? Part of what I was looking for there was I was looking for our students making a connection to the story in terms of can they bring their self into the story? Can they see what is happening, and can they make personal connections to, is it okay for the raccoon to hold down the eagle when they are trying to learn something from them? How does it, so kind of like looking at those aspects, as well as sort of leading into the number pieces and the math aspects towards the end. But kind of also wanting to have them think about how can this story help us think about our learning as a person, as well as just straight connecting into the math piece. So that was one of the things I was looking for when we were doing the notice and wonder. And then when they were working on the whiteboard tasks, a lot of that conversation was sort of focused around, okay, are they understanding the idea that we're going to have to sort of separate the different combinations of the genetic factors? Are they understanding that we're going to have to, it's going to be different for the genetic combination of each mom, and also different depending on which dad is being combined in there. So making sure that they're not just sort of saying, oh, here's my one example and now we're finished. And then kind of prompting with ideas like, oh, this is, I can see that you're thinking for this combination. Is there any other possibilities that could happen, or is this the only one? And so kind of linking to those prompts as it carried on. And then when we sort of towards the share out piece, really wanted to make sure that we were having an opportunity to try and share and learn from each other. So have a chance for them to speak and to show these are the strategies for how we organized our thinking, and these are the things that our group talked about and why we made the decisions that we did, so that we had an opportunity to sort of look at different ways that the thinking and the organization happened for that information. And then coming back at the very end, sort of back to the story and thinking, how can we now as individuals sort of extend, now that we have this knowledge, how can we pay that piece forward? How can we go out into the community with this and have it make a difference for us from here out? Kind of looking for that idea of, have they made a connection to something that they personally can do and take away with them? Maybe even something just using the correct name from here forward, and why that's important. So those were sort of the pieces that I was looking for as we were moving through.
Yeah, I mean, what you just mentioned is like the principle of reciprocity from Indigenous Storywork. So I'm learning this, I'm taking this, and what am I giving back, and how I'm moving that forward. All of what you said there is a beautiful example, I think, of engaging with the principles of Indigenous Storywork in a very connected, interrelated way. There are some questions in the chat though that I noticed that are coming up. And maybe Janice, I think you're monitoring the chat. Maybe there's a couple there. I know someone asked about the grade level of the task. What grade did you use it with?
I tried this out with grade 10s because that's just who I happen to have access to right now. So I tried this out with grade 10s and it worked really well. I think absolutely probably could even work with grades 8s and grade 9, right up through 11. And I think even 12s. I think I could do this with any grade grouping kind of in our high school, I think would work okay. Yeah, the group I tried was with the 10s.
And Nichola, I guess
Thank you.
someone who was also asking about what grade level you were teaching this with, if you would be willing to share an outline of your lesson. Somehow, I don't know if you have that written up in a way that we could share on the Indigenous Math Education Network website. That might be one way to share it with the community, if you're willing to do that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, and then another question that came up with is one of the participants just missed what you said. You were describing assessment, and I think she really liked it, and she wasn't quite sure exactly what you said. Something about something, talk, and check. Maybe you were just sort of talking off the top of your head. So
I might have been, but I think maybe when I was referring to sort of like the ball toss scenario, sort of like
yeah,
sort of like playing catch a little bit with the students. Sort of you toss it out there and you're seeing what they do with it, but you have to be ready to get that ball back,
right.
depending on how they're going to throw it and what they get up to. Maybe that part.
Yeah, and I think she added that in relation to, learning where they are and where the holes are, which is, I think you were right. That's when you were talking about that, responsive pedagogy, right? And that's assessment is such a big part of that we have to find out where they are and then we respond, right?
Mm-hmm.
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 And I think like for me, it kind of, I think in order to do the ball toss, I had to really sit down and think through this math task on my own first. I had to really sit down and think through what are all the possible combinations that they have and where might be the pitfalls that students sort of fall into and where might they have a hard time getting themselves back out.
Right.
And so kind of having a plan a little bit, like in terms of, there could be different combinations depending what dad's involved, and just sort of thinking through where those spots might be in before I started was helpful.
And then the last question is, thank you for sharing this experience. Where did the discussion within the students happen, in the park or in the classroom?
This is a great question. I wish that it was at the park, but it was not. We were in the classroom. So I used sort of, as we kind of started working with the story, I just actually just started out with asking students, because the park is close to us, if anyone had visited there. And we started, and many had. So we kind of actually started with the conversation of, have you been? What was your experience? What did you notice? What did you do while you were in the park? And then we sort of looked at it on Google Maps. So we sort of, here is where the park is in relation to where we are. And then we sort of linked into David's oral story that he shares, which is available online. So it was able to kind of go with the classroom that way, but we weren't physically at the park.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question, Nichola? What inspired you to, how did you decide that this is where you wanted to go? Because I know for some teachers it might be helpful to kind of think about, what sparked this, and then how did you what pathway you took?
Yeah. So this is an area that I really feel like I haven't done well yet. So being able to sort of bring in Indigenous story work, I think I have felt that so far when I've tried to approach it, it hasn't clicked well in a way that's sort of organically bringing in the math. I feel like it has been, for me, a little bit something that I'm sort of like not forcing in, but it just hasn't clicked in a way that felt organic and naturally led into the math portions and was able to kind of, work in that full circle way. And so I think that was the reason why I really wanted to try this out. And what inspired me was what kind of helped me click it into place for myself, was looking at the principles of Storywork that Dr. Archibald had outlined and being able to kind of go through and see, so rather than just jumping into the story, we need to set that stage and we need to look at how do we build in respect for the story? How do we get ourselves situated to the place of the story? How do we prepare our own bodies and our own minds for being ready to hear that story and kind of participate in not only some math work, but some cultural work? And when I had sort of seen it in that framework, all of a sudden for me, it clicked. I think this is what I have been missing. This is why it hasn't felt organic. This is why it's felt like because I haven't been properly setting that stage and I haven't been working full circle with the story in that way. So I think that was why I wanted to try this out and kind of approach it, was because I wanted to see, can I figure out for me how to do this in a way that makes it feel more organic and makes it flow together nicely. And I feel like when I tried it out with my group of grade 10s, I feel like it really did click for me and it went really well.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, maybe I could respond a bit here. Nichola, thank you for sharing that teaching experience. How wonderful, that you were able to draw on various Indigenous storywork principles to be there to help you whenever you felt you needed, that idea of how building in or understanding and then practicing examples of respect about the story and the storyteller. And I love that you have there's a video, of David Bodley telling that story, but also setting the context, I mean, wonderful conversation about, its original name and what happened, why it changed, and now it's back to its original name. That idea, I heard you say, come full circle, and that's so neat, and trying to get a sense of the First Nations taking back control of their land and their context. And, in that particular story too, it made me think of other ideas perhaps that students in different grade levels might draw upon or think about. I was thinking about that, the white raccoon, made me wonder, how did they survive? And what happened to them? Were there other stories maybe of characteristics about the champagne-colored raccoon? And then to think about what else we might learn from that story. And I was really happy to hear you say you returned to the story. It wasn't that you just introduced it once and then set it aside and, didn't take it up again, but the story guided the learning and I think the assessment along the way. And, that story could also continue to maybe guide, other learning that is about math or connected maybe to other subject areas. And wonderful to hear about high school level learning there, because we've often wondered about that. But certainly the story can, I'm sure, work well in other grade levels. And I'd be interested to hear other folks who are participating and listening in this webinar, thinking about how you might be able to draw on this particular story and connect it to math learning. It really shows that assessment can be a part of and connected to story, to place, to pedagogy, that there is, not a thread, but something that continues all along, that they are connected, embedded, but yet they can have a distinct nature too there. And I think this idea of assessment being vibrant, what you have done, that's vibrant pedagogy and assessment. So I do raise my hands in thanks and respect to you, Nichola, for sharing this wonderful example.
Just going back to the questions that we collected from the last session and revisiting those here, we have a little bit of time if we'd like to be able to just chat a little bit about some of these questions ourselves, or people can offer some comments to the questions in the chat, or maybe we can start by asking ourselves some of these questions. Is there any question there, Janice, that you would like to take up?
So the one I was thinking about, Cynthia, was on the next slide. Yeah, so the question, how do we teach and assess in ways that support students working at their own pace, but at the same time keeping the class together? And I think about this a lot in my work and in my collaboration with teachers and students. And I think some of the things that sort of have helped my thinking around this are, is some of those principles about remembering that learning takes place over time. And that's an Indigenous principle, but it's also, when we look at cognitive science and that research, we know that students are better situated for the learning to stick with them and to endure if they have more spaced opportunities instead of, thinking about doing a unit of study for 2 or 3 weeks and then closing the book on that and moving on to something else, that we do shorter bursts of learning with students and then move on to something else and then come back to it and then move on to something else and then come back to it again. And that we're sort of layering that learning on for students, I think is a really sort of responsive and respectful way to students in terms of how they learn. So those are some of the things that I've been thinking a lot about when planning and designing for learning, is how are we giving students opportunities to learn in different ways and at different rates and in different spaces. So how do we provide those different choices for students to learn over time? And I think as the teacher, like, okay, I've got, 20 children in my class or 28 children in my class, they can't all be in different places, but then what is it that unites them and brings them together? It might be a common goal that you come together with. We're all learning about fractions. And so you have your fraction materials out and some of the tools that you might use for fractions. But children are in different spaces in their learning of fractions, whether they're learning in grade 3 just what a fraction is, or grade 5 students are learning about equivalent fractions. Grade 8s are starting to use operations with fractions. You're going to have that range in any class that you have, regardless of what grade level they're in. So how can we open up some of our learning experiences so students can find access points in different ways with materials or with the mathematical ideas themselves? And to me, that's sort of a way of opening it up so that we're still moving along together, but every child is getting what they need for their learning in the moment.
I think you've answered all 3 questions on that slide. Like, it kind of started with the third one, looking at the time and place, and they're at different times and places. But I think you nicely talked about how to keep students together, which is the first question. How do we assess individually, but also keep the class together as a group? Kind of moving through, and thinking of tasks or activities that are open enough to be able to allow students at different places to be able to be invited into it. And letting them have some of that choice as well. So, do you have some particular resources that would be helpful for teachers, like maybe Marion Small's
Yeah,
work?
I mean,
Or
that's the one I usually recommend is Dr. Marion Small's Open Questions books. She has them across different grade bands, as well as different math content areas like data or geometry or number. And she has different types of open questions depending what part of the lesson is, if you're launching a lesson, or that sort of investigation part in the middle, or that consolidation piece at the end. So different types of questions she offers. And then there's trying to remember the title of those purple books from Australia.
Oh, yeah.
Open, do you know which ones I mean, Cynthia? Those
Yeah.
beautiful open questions as well. And then I think, not everyone realizes this, but when you go to our BC curriculum and you go to the big ideas section, and you click on the elaborations for the big ideas, there are actually student inquiry or investigation questions already written for every learning standard in our K-12 curriculum. And so you can look at those inquiry questions as sort of inspiration for planning, for our whole week. We're going to look at this. How are multiplication and division related? And looking at relationships, that concept of relationships. And that can be your focus for the whole week, but you design different tasks and experiences throughout that week. But your guiding question is right there for you in those elaborations in our curriculum. So those are also really helpful for planning and designing sort of connected and more holistic approaches to teaching mathematics.
Yeah. Good. And then we also talked about universal design,
Mhm.
UDL. Can you say just a little bit about that? That might be helpful for some people as well.
Sure. I mean, that is, it comes from, a design perspective, and, designing architecture and access to buildings and parks, etc. But it has been very much used in education, and, quite a bit of research around that. Katie Novak, for one, is someone who does a lot of research in universal design for learning. And she's just come out with a book this fall on mathematics specifically and UDL. And that really is, sort of accepting that there is variability in our learners. That very first sort of acceptance and recognition that there will be variability in our classes. And then we're going to design for that. It's not going to be the exception, it's going to be the rule. And then with that, the other key principle is that we'll all have a learning goal. There is variability, but we all have a consistent learning goal that we're working towards. And then the other key principle, the third principle around UDL, is student agency. And so that's where choice comes in for students, whether it's with the materials, time and place, whether it's how they communicate their learning, what choices are we providing in terms of how students, and when they share, they know something. What timelines are we working on, our timelines or the students' timelines? So it's giving agency to students for their learning. And so those are sort of the three big principles around UDL that we can consider when we're planning and designing for mathematics.
Yeah. And I think it fits very nicely with thinking about assessment as ecosystems,
Mhm.
because it is embedded in all of our thinking
Mhm.
about it. So starting with that, as Nichola talked about, thinking about how are students going to, what might they take up or miss, or what direction might they go in,
Mhm.
and how can I be open to thinking about what to do when I see that, so that you're not just trying to push them down the same channel, or,
Yeah, and
going the
whenever
same
I think about
direction.
ecosystems, I think about like food maps, and sort of from my science
Mm,
background, and sort of mapping things and connecting things. And to me, that's very much what we do as teachers. The dance of teaching in the classroom is we're connecting dots, we're responding, and that is that ecosystem metaphor. Is that there's reciprocal relationships, and there are responsive relationships as well. And so, and then there's that interdependence piece, right? There's the interdependence of the human relationships, but also of the place and space and the materials, and the education system itself, that we navigate, within that ecosystem of the classroom or the school or the system.
yes, exactly.
Mhm.
Okay. Stephanie, is there a question that you'd like to pick up? Stephanie is doing her doctoral degree in assessment in math education. And is there
Yeah,
anything on this slide or the other slide?
it was the other slide, actually. I was
Okay.
looking at the first two. So how can we ensure differentiated assessment that are meaningful and relevant to our students? And also the second one, how can we teach math that balances building on students' experiences, community knowledge that doesn't limit their future success in the course? And to answer these, I'm sort of drawing on what Joanne had said in terms of holism and understanding students as a whole person, the body, mind, heart. And thinking about assessment, if I'm going to plan an assessment, I think about the environment, the impact of that environment on students, the modality of communication. So how am I gathering evidence of learning? How am I communicating with students? What am I doing to give feedback? The medium that we're working with. So perhaps we're outside, perhaps we're inside. What manipulatives are we potentially using? And then I also think about the content. So that would be the mathematics that is enacted. And drawing on this idea of assessment as ecosystem, an ecosystem is so complex. There are so many moving parts and so many relationships that are in a dynamic. And so thinking about assessment, there are moving parts as well. It is part of the learning. So as Cynthia had mentioned, assessment as pedagogy, it is the whole. It is pedagogy. It includes all those moments during instruction where we're noticing and wondering about student learning, where we're conversing with students, when we're setting up those relationships where students can feel like they can come in and share their interest and share their funds of knowledge. And so to answer these two questions, I'm sort of thinking about knowing ahead of time what we would like to assess, and also attending to creating and enabling an environment where students can communicate their learning with us in ways that suit their needs and wants, and in ways where perhaps there are multiple mathematical pathways in a solution, or perhaps we're in conversation with a student during an instructional period that we hadn't intended to have any assessment going on, but a student mentions an interest or a story, and we can later build on that as an assessment task. And so Nichola gave such a wonderful example of a relevant space, a relevant place for students. And so thinking about, where do I live? What are the stories on the land that I live? What are the stories that students are bringing to my classroom? And then the resources I use depend on what I know about the answer to those questions. So perhaps a student would say, hey, I went to Horlock Park the other day. It was really fun. And that might spark, for me, I can look at, what's the history of Horlock Park? What is the original name of that place? What are the stories embedded in that place? And what mathematics are enacted in that ecosystem? And drawing out the mathematics that we can learn from place and land. And I think much richer conversations, much richer mathematical conversations can come from those. And so I don't necessarily see context-based math tasks as in competition with future success. I see them kind of as really rich opportunities to assess student learning.
Nice. Yeah, so you addressing the second questionnaire to limit their future success. I think sometimes we think that taking the time to go outside or to create these contexts or connect with a story will take time away from moving forward to be able to cover the content in order to be successful in our next course. So it is related to the time. But if and Janice gave some examples of the elaborations and the competencies, being able to go to those and then tied into what you were suggesting there, Stephanie, I think we're able to do both at the same time rather than either or, can be and both. Good. Thank you for that. And I'm not sure if did we give people the link to this document, Janice, or no? If people wanted to have some questions that they could put up there, you're certainly welcome to do that. And we can think about how we can bring those into our final session that will be in April. And then maybe I can just wrap up.
Cynthia, but it isn't posted yet, but I will find it and post it.
Okay, great. Thank you. So just thinking about kind of wrapping up our session today with this beautiful quote from Frances Sue, a mathematician, who wrote a book called Mathematics for Human Flourishing. And he talks about it in terms of human flourishing, and we're kind of playing with this idea of mathematical flourishing. But he asks, how can the deeply human themes that drive us to do mathematics be channeled to build a more beautiful and just world in which all, and he's really referring to humans, but we're extending it to human more than human, can truly flourish. So this idea of mathematical flourishing being a place that we create in our own environments, in our classrooms, inside, and the classroom could be inside the four walls or outside on the beach or wherever in the forest. But how do we create these spaces for mathematical flourishing in which assessment is a part of that? So that's what we're trying to explore here with this series that looks at assessment as pedagogy, assessment as Indigenous storywork, and assessment as ecosystems, all around drawing upon Indigenous pedagogies and practices. So thinking about the earth as teacher is very much an Indigenous pedagogy. If we can begin to think about how we can learn from earth, learn from land and place, and keep keep that open to with our three ears, as Joanne said, the one between on each side of our head and in our heart, to be able to think about mathematical flourishing in lots of different places. So just to wrap up, then we have just a nod to the Edith Lando Center, which Edith Lando Virtual Learning Center, which you can follow, and there's lots of other different webinars that are available there. If you use the QR code, you can get that, or just type in Edith Lando Virtual Learning Center, and you will find the other videos for this session, Centering Indigenous Pedagogies in Math Education. You will find January's video there, and February's, today's, will be up in a week or so. And then we have our last one in April 16th. So look for that coming up, and come with your questions. If you have questions you want to put in the chat that you'd like us, or in the Google document that you'd like us to think about, then you can put those in there as well. Anything else anybody would like to share or say? Okay, then I just want to say thank you everyone for attending and joining us in this really challenging area to think about assessment. And appreciate Nichola for coming and sharing your work with us so that we have a bit more concrete examples to be able to share. And for everyone else who shared questions in the chat, all of these are making this conversation richer and helping us extend our learning and thinking about what this means in the context of math education and assessment. Or if you have even in the Google document, if you have some more ideas that you would like us to talk about or to focus on, or if you know of somebody who's doing some amazing work and we should reach out to them, please let us know. That would be really a great a connection to make. Okay, so I think we're wrapping up. So thank you everybody again, and hopefully we'll see you in April 16th for our last webinar for this particular series. Bye everybody.